Professor, thanks so much for taking the time. I appreciate it.
Morning.
Now, you've devoted so much of your work, your research, in the areas of public safety, foreign relations. It seems like in the last several years, you focused a lot of that on digital media and social media and the impact of those things on public safety. Why is that? Is that simply a reflection of the time?
Um, to some degree, yeah. When I first started looking at terrorism about, say, 20, 25 years ago, one of the things that struck me was the communicative aspect that's necessary for terrorists to achieve their objectives, their political objectives. The violence is meant to communicate certain messages to their target audiences. So I've always been kind of focused to some degree or another on how violent non-state actors and bad actors in general try and use various mechanisms to communicate their objectives and achieve their objectives through that means. And along came social media and the internet and those things. And I started looking at what I called influence warfare at the time, back in 2009. My thinking about those topics has evolved to include digital influence warfare, social media, deep fakes, videos, all those kinds of things since then. And it's also expanded beyond the realms of terrorists and even criminal organizations, and now looking at the that rogue states are using social media for this digital influence warfare purposes I talked about.
You've coined, it seems, this term digital mercenaries. Can you break that down?
Yeah, so mercenaries have been around, time immortal. There's been all kinds of mercenaries who've been hired by kings and popes and all kinds of different leaders in years, ancient years ago, to conduct warfare on their behalf for money. They're not motivated by patriotism or loyalty to any particular country or leader. They're doing it for money. So mercenaries have been around for forever. And what I've noticed over the last 15, 20 years is that now we're seeing the evolution of mercenaries engaged in warfare-like activities, not just in the physical realm, like the Wagner Group does in Syria or in Ukraine or in Africa now. But also they're doing a lot of this same kind of actions against targets in the digital space. So they're targeting different audiences, using social media, using the internet to try and influence perceptions, behaviors of the targets on behalf of a paying customer. They can do this on behalf of states, corporations, criminal organizations, you name it, political organizations. And they're getting paid fairly well by doing that. And one of the things that I uncovered in terms of looking at this digital influence mercenary activity is there's also a secondary way that they're also making money, and that's by manipulating the algorithms and getting paid to influence the behaviors, the perceptions, beliefs of those targets. And they're getting paid pretty well for that. But then they're also making money off the ways in which algorithms feed us information on social media, and they're pushing people towards ad-heavy websites that try and give them some justification for believing in conspiracy theories like QAnon or whatnot. So there's a expanding realm of profit making in what I'm seeing now in terms of the digital influence mercenaries.
Now, how sophisticated are these operations, right? Social media in general, right, is designed, or it's effectively a machine, right, that's designed to kind of target people based on certain behavioral mechanisms that it comes up with. How is that applied? How dangerous is that when you're talking about warfare and global public safety?
No, there's a lot of things you can unpack from that, just from that particular lens. If the goal is to exacerbate political polarization in a democracy, social media provides all kinds of opportunities to do that. One of the things we saw here in the US during the 2016 presidential election, for example, is that certain actors online were encouraging protests and conspiracy theories and all kinds of things for both pro-Trump and pro-Clinton political activists and voters and so forth. So they're basically trying to increase the amount of anger and disinformation that provokes that kind of anger in terms of both sides of that political debate. That, of course, when they increase the amount of political polarization within a democracy, it makes those individuals in democracy less likely to have much concern or to do anything about what the originators of that strategy are trying to achieve in the foreign policy realm. So, for example, hypothetically, let's say that Russia was paying certain digital influence mercenaries to engage in this behavior in order to exacerbate the political polarization in the United States. Their goal would be to divert and distract the U.S. population from paying attention to the annexation of the Crimea, for example, or for some of the other things that Russia has done in the foreign policy realm. And to some degree, it's worked for them. They've been able to, deflect and distract a lot of attention away from what they're trying to achieve in other realms by making us more angry at each other, make us much more focused on, trying to win certain zero-sum games in the U.S. and so forth.
You've described in your book, your 2021 book, Digital Influence Warfare in the Age of Social Media, a variety of these tools that are used, right? Fake bots and accounts and fake news articles. Which of these, if you can pinpoint one, I'm sure you can, would you deem most pervasive, that you see often, that the public generally should watch out for?
Emotional provocation. That seems to be the most effective way to get the behavior that the digital influence mercenaries or attackers or whatever you want to call them, in terms of their objectives. The emotional provocation could be getting you to defend what you believe, or it could be getting you to attack others based on some disinformation about how evil they or their policies or positions may be. I think one of the things that we've lost sight of, a lot of us here in different countries, even when we're interacting with social media, is that because of the safety or perceived safety of sitting in front of our computer or a smartphone or whatever, we approach social media in a rather individualistic kind of false sense of security. And we may not be necessarily recognizing the fact that we're being manipulated for a certain objective that we may not even understand. And the ability for them to manipulate us in this emotional provocation way is something that we've not really done much in terms of media literacy education here in the U.S. to prevent.
Is there a remedy to this that is legislative, or is it within the purview of the executive branch, or is it a combination of both, right? Because it's a weird area in which Congress can legislate, obviously, and you have the executive branch headed by the commander in chief, and you seem to have a blend of these issues colliding in those two branches of government.
Yeah, that's a very insightful question. The problem we have with government intervention in these kinds of things is that the majority of what we're talking about is owned and operated by the private sector. And so there's all kinds of things that the government may want to see or may want to have happen, but there's only so much you can get the private sector to do. You can incentivize them to do certain things. You can punish them if they cross certain boundaries or certain laws that you've put in place. But the Supreme Court has struck down a lot of those attempts to impose governmental intervention in the private sector. And so a lot of the success we've seen so far, especially in the counterterrorism realm, in countering online disinformation or provocation or whatever, have been really private sector originated. Google, Facebook, a bunch of the big private sector players have funded a number of initiatives, including the Global Internet Forum for Countering Terrorism. There's Tech Against Terrorism. There's other kinds of different things which are non-governmental efforts. And they've been pretty successful at identifying these kinds of threats and then responding to them appropriately. And then, of course, there's also the in-house divisions and departments within Google, Facebook, Twitter, that there's a lot of harm identification and mitigation efforts within their own social media platforms. And this is not imposed by the government. It's not legislated. It is basically something that's good for the company and their shareholders. And that's why they're doing it.
Right. So what you're talking about is the First Amendment issues, right? Whenever here in the US you have these regulations of speech, and social media is an extension of that. You have the constitutional red flags go up, and the case law in this country has been pretty clear for decades and decades, right? Incitement of violence, clear and present danger. There are exceptions, right? There are ways in which speech could be regulated. Um, do you view this as falling within any of those categories? At least arguably, that argument can be made.
It's a slippery slope, unfortunately, because there's a lot of things that we would want individual citizens of the country to take responsibility for themselves. Their failure to do so then suggests, well, we're going to have to do something else at the government level, including regulation, to try and mitigate the harm that's being caused by these types of activities online. The Supreme Court is very, especially these days, in terms of the Supreme Court makeup right now, they're very hesitant, I think, to impose certain kinds of parameters on what can and cannot be said, what cannot be done online. The harm, I think, is recognized by most people who look at this from an objective point of view. The problem we run into is there's a political dimension to this, a very heavy politicized dimension to this now, both in terms of what should or shouldn't be called certain kinds of harms, who is responsible for certain kinds of harms. There's still disagreement in Congress about whether or not Russia had anything to do with the spread of disinformation in the last several political elections, for example. The data and the evidence are all there to support these kinds of allegations, but there are certain members of Congress, elected members of Congress, who refuse to accept that data and evidence. And so, agreeing on a regulation or a series of regulations that would be beneficial across the board, regardless of a political stance, that's been proven rather elusive right now for this political environment.
You were quoted, I think, several weeks ago in Newsweek about what you're referring to exactly now, the politicization of some of these terms, right? And the conflation of the domestic terrorist groups or the alleged domestic terrorist groups with the terrorist groups that are abroad. What distinctions do you see in terms of social media's effect when it comes to foreign terrorism as opposed to domestic terrorism? And obviously, those words are broad and mean a lot, generally speaking.
Yeah, that's another great question. The act of terrorism, in what I've studied over the last 25 years or so, is kind of viewed as a criminal deviant behavior. It's human behavior because humans do this. Dolphins don't terrorize other dolphins. Koala bears don't terrorize other dolphins, or koala bears. The idea being that human beings figure their way around obstacles. So we can put up all kinds of regulations and obstacles, either the private sector, social media platform level, or the governmental level, or whatnot. And human beings who want to achieve certain goals and objectives will find a way around those obstacles. That's just kind of human nature. We've seen this time immortal. So when it comes to whether or not the source of the disinformation, or in terms of terrorism, the source of the communication is foreign origin or domestic origin, I tend not to really care much about that, because the overall goal of terrorism is to coerce a population, a target, and its government to try and achieve certain objectives. You're using violence and the credible threat of violence to try and achieve those objectives. And if a society allows itself to be coerced, the terrorists win, or in this case, the digital influence mercenaries or the digital influence, state actors even win. And that's something that really can't be regulated. It's something that I think that needs to be taught and nurtured in a society to be more resilient, to be a bit more vigilant about the fact that there are attempts to try and manipulate their perceptions and beliefs, whether it's terrorists or whether it's state actors using social media. The same end goal is in mind, and that is they're trying to achieve objective by manipulating us. And we need to stand up to it. And we need to sort of learn how to recognize what's going on and say, we're not going to take any more of this. We're going to refute your efforts to try and coerce me through fear. or convince me of something that's not true through disinformation, provocation, and whatnot. And that's something that isn't really regulation; it's more public education. And I think we've kind of lost the script when it comes to that particular need.
You hit on my exact question. Social media seems to be a new idea relatively, right? And it targets primarily kids and younger folks. How much of this falls on parents? How much of this falls on schools at every level?
Yeah, that's another great question. We've parents of unfortunately, in many corners of U.S. society, anyway, parents have kind of abdicated their responsibility when it comes to educating their children. They've handed it over to the teachers and the schools and said, "Here, you deal with getting my kid into a position to be a productive member of society, to go to a good college, to have a wealthy and happy life going forward." There's been an unfortunate abdication of those responsibilities at the parental level, and includes just basically talking to their children about what is and isn't valid uses of social media and online activities and all that. Some of that I think has changed in the last, say, 10, 15 years with a younger generation of parents that understand social media, the internet. But the previous generation, I mean, that generation still thinks in terms of Blackberries and flip phones. I think it's a generational thing to some degree. The more the parents become much more familiar with what's going on, what TikTok is, what Facebook is, what these different social media platforms are doing to children, and recognizing their responsibility to not regulate necessarily what their child does, uh, but educate their child to have an informed and responsible approach to their uses of social media in the internet. That's a parental responsibility that many parents have just said, "Oh, that's the schools need to teach that," or they'll learn that on their own, kind of thing. And I think that's a mistake.
You did mention schools. What can schools do, particularly at the middle school and high school levels when kids are particularly impressionable? And now kids are so sophisticated in using these devices. And these are global devices where information is obtained from all corners of the world. Is there anything schools can do? And when I say that, I mean specific blockers that they can use and perhaps educational programs, things of that nature.
Yeah, there are certainly things that schools can do. Some schools have imposed, technical signal blockers. They don't allow any kind of social media activity while the students are on campus of the school. Many schools have embraced media literacy. Basic media literacy programs. Usually they're extracurricular or there's something that's not really built into the curriculum, but some schools have actually included those media literacy programs and objectives in their curriculum wholesale. The tricky part is when you have a public school, for example, that has usually a school board, and they have differences of opinions about what is or isn't appropriate uses of social media, what websites are appropriate or not appropriate to go to for research papers or for news sources or whatnot. There have been ample examples of certain school boards that have um, rejected a request for a school to have a subscription to the New York Times or Washington Post because the school board claims that it's a politicized, anti-Republican kind of newspaper. We don't allow our students to. I mean, basically they're taking that particular source of information and politicizing it and rejecting or banning that access for those schools. So when you have an effort trying to increase students' literacy and responsibility and willingness to validate the sources of information that they're going to, either for daily news or for research papers or whatnot. And the school board is rejecting many of those sources, not on the grounds of evidence or data or valid information, but a political orientation. That gets very problematic. And I think that's where some of these programs just kind of get lost in the weeds and shut down for the wrong reasons.
You mentioned a minute ago how this all came to light in the 2016 election. And I agree with you. A lot of this stuff, particularly with the disinformation campaigns, came to light at that time, right? And the country kind of went crazy over it. What has the government done to see that this doesn't happen again? I know folks have been prosecuted, but is there anything en masse that has been done to ensure that future elections, there already has been one since then, obviously, future elections aren't impacted by this kind of stuff?
Yeah, Homeland Security, Department of Homeland Security launched the CISA. It's a department within the DHS that looks at election interference online, tries to monitor it, encourages the different social media platforms, when identified, to shut down those sources, block those sources of information. There's a lot of efforts that the government would like to impose, but can't, of course, because of like the regulation and prohibitions we talked about earlier. But they're convening different conferences to bring together experts and technological leaders to look at things like what they call what's the term they use? Not inappropriate, but unauthorized coordinated activity, and inauthentic coordinated activities, where it's clearly efforts by some entity online to use a whole massive team of bots of fake accounts to try and coerce a population, a target, convince them that there's a massive upswelling of support or anger against or support for a certain political position. It's all being automated by these fake accounts. And so you can now identify those things and try and block those things to a large degree now. And so sharing of best practices, lessons learned, government's trying to encourage those kinds of activities as well across the private sector. And of course, like you referenced, there have been prosecutions, there have been efforts to sanction, whether it's the Internet Research Agency in Russia, or they don't call themselves that anymore, in St. Petersburg, or other online entities that have been known to do this en masse, to the tune of hundreds of thousands of these fake accounts, all coordinated to try and shape a certain perception about an event or about a policy. There's efforts now to try and educate the public to some degree about these things by publishing all these reports, whether it's the congressional report, the Mueller report, whatever government reports have been put together from several years of research. They're trying to do some education of the public about who's doing what and why, and what we should be aware of, and hopefully try and prevent in the future. But hope is not a strategy. You still have to have some sort of overarching strategy to prevent this from happening again. And unfortunately, like I said earlier, this is human behavior. It's deviant human behavior that they will figure out their way around obstacles that we put in their place. And so at the end of the day, it falls on us individual consumers, individual users of social media and internet, to take some responsibility, to educate ourselves, to validate the information we see in front of us on our screens, maybe double or triple check the sources of information that we're seeing. Especially going to be important during this next election cycle with all the deep fake videos, deep fake images, the rise of artificial intelligence in generating these kinds of videos and images. It's going to be very problematic in the next several years, because they're going to be engineered specifically to provoke our emotional reaction. There's going to be all kinds of visual evidence to make us think that something happened which did not happen, or someone said something that they didn't say. And it's going to be purposeful in terms of trying to get us wound up and angry about something that never even happened. And that's the goal of many of these efforts.
No, I agree with you. It seems that if you have a country in which millions of people will believe, for example, that a major political candidate is hiding slaves in his or her basement or something of that nature, that seems to be a bigger problem, right? That seems to be you can regulate it to some degree, but it seems to be an educational issue. It seems to be a societal issue that has to be addressed in some other way, because again, we're talking about millions and millions of people.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's something that they're taking advantage of an existing state of mind. we're inclined to believe the worst in people that we've come to have disagreements with, and that I think the more they can get us disagreeing with each other, the better off they are to our disadvantage. And so I don't think there's really much effort right now to build bridges across political divides, to get people to view the humanity, the core humanity that exists beneath the surface of these political campaigns and candidates and positions and so forth. And until we collectively decide that we want to overcome these kinds of divisions that are being exacerbated and so forth, we're going to continue to face these kind of challenges in the future. I know that's a really pessimistic view of the future, but unfortunately, I think that's kind of where we are right now.
Prosecutors' offices, whenever they see an issue, whether it's hate crimes or domestic violence, so on and so forth, on federal, state, local levels, they are very good at mobilizing units, creating bureaus to address these issues. Is that something that you see happening across the country today?
Not that often. I've seen it. It's kind of hard to generalize across the board because there are so many differences across the nation. I would say in some of the bigger cities, whether it's San Francisco, Los Angeles, New York City, Boston, some of the bigger cities, I think we're seeing some traction, some effort to try and address these issues at that level. But there's a lot of other jurisdictions that they're not as so how do I put this delicately? They're not as enthusiastic, I guess is how I would put it, to tackle these kinds of issues for various reasons, which are very pragmatic, very and sometimes political, sometimes related directly to funding. So yeah, it just kind of varies across the country in terms of what we're seeing.
You've written in the past about how each of us can learn to identify disinformation and other efforts, right, to defend ourselves. What can each individual person do?
Well, first off, when you see something that reinforces your belief, your position about how evil someone else is, maybe take a moment to just pause and reflect whether or not what you're seeing is actually accurate and true, or if it's being purposely put in front of you because the author of that information or disinformation in many cases already knows what you're going to like and not like. And so they're basically trying to reinforce a point of view that they're going to benefit more from than you are. And so if we take a few seconds to just pause and reflect, am I being manipulated here? Is there some effort here to try and provoke me to react in the way that I'm about to react? Just that hesitation could, go quite a long ways to slow down the spread of the disinformation. If we're less instinctually hitting that share button or that like button or retweet button or whatever it is that your social media platform offers to you, to indicate your willingness to either support a particular image, video, statement, or even reject and defend and argue against a certain image or video or statement. If we just take a moment and pause and maybe even step away from the social media for a minute or two and then go back to it and relook at it again, just that moment of pause and the subconscious may kick in and saying, maybe this isn't something that's actually accurate. Maybe you should check that make sure that this is actually one of the classic examples in recent years when there was a video of who was it? It was Nancy Pelosi was speaking in some kind of press conference, whatever, and someone took that video and just subtly slowed it down just a small bit of speed to make it look like she was slurring her words.
I know what you're talking about.
And millions of people, including the president at the time, put it out there as if it was real, put it out there and encouraged others to view it as real and condemned her. I mean, that's the kind of thing that's relatively easy to do because so many people that were reading this and or seeing this information were already inclined to not like Nancy Pelosi. And so they immediately shared, retweeted, and it just spread like wildfire. The more we take responsibility to sort of think about whether or not we really want to do that, as a society, as an individual, Whether or not we like certain people or not, what benefit are we getting personally from engaging in that kind of instinctual sharing, retweeting, liking, and that kind of stuff? That's what the social media platforms want us to do. But is it really in our best interest to do as an individual? That's something that, again, pausing and thinking about for a few minutes may benefit society as a whole, but we're not there yet.
Professor, thank you so much for your time. It's incredibly insightful. Any upcoming works project you'd like to discuss?
Um, right now, I'm going to be focusing a lot of attention on what happens in this next election cycle. My biggest concern right now, as I mentioned, is the use of generative artificial intelligence to create these new deep fake videos, deep fake images. My concern is that there's going to be a lot of disinformation that's meant to provoke certain behaviors. And the more that we go into this election cycle, we as a society go into this election cycle recognizing that there's going to be just a whole plethora of individuals, both foreign and domestic, that are going to be trying to shape our perceptions using disinformation, using stuff that's not real, including these deep fake AI generated images and videos. If we take a moment of caution as we approach what we see online, I think the outcome would be better. But I'm worried that there's a lot of people who just are not either willing or even attuned to the idea of taking a moment of caution before they proceed.
Oh, Professor, pessimistic, but nonetheless realistic. I appreciate your time. Thank you so much.